Dr. Bill Rosenberg, William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, joins us from time to time. He is the co-author of News Verdicts, The Debates and Presidential Campaigns, and The Politics of Disenchantment, Bush, Clinton, Perot, and the Press. Among other things, as I said, he is tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg. And I think we're going to go into his classroom, first of all. Good morning. Thanks for being here, Bill.
Good morning. Yeah, I'm doing double duty today. I've got 2 classes today.
Oh, man, 2 classes. Whew, can you keep up the pace?
They're 2
you need a week
hours
off like Congress.
So I have to work at it.
Oh, that's a long time. That's a lot of time to be teaching. Speaking of which, I want to go into your classroom. You teach about something called legitimacy, authority, and sovereignty. Tell us how that applies to where we are politically in the U.S. right now.
Well, political scientists often talk about these 3 terms, political legitimacy, authority, and sovereignty, and they're very important. The idea basically is legitimacy is the sense that there's this mass feeling that government rule is right and should be respected and should be obeyed. The second one, sovereignty, is that the national government's the boss on its own turf, the final rule of law. And finally, authority is that political leaders have the ability to command respect and exercise their power. And I think what we're really looking at is a period in our history where these 3 central tenets about government are a little bit under assault. I mean, if you go back to the 2016 election, there was the question about whether or not Donald Trump was the legitimate election winner. Indeed, he was. He won the Electoral Colleges, which is how we determine our vote. But he did lose the popular vote, and he's one of several presidents who lost the popular vote across time. And I think this put a particular itch in his craw where he wanted to assault the political system and lash out against people who said that perhaps he wasn't legitimate. Seems like the Democrats dropped that argument about legitimacy very quickly because they realized that's what the law is. When you take a look at sovereignty, we see right now Donald Trump using sovereignty as a major red meat issue to stir up his base for the upcoming fall elections. And he's particularly focusing on immigration and the wall and border security, which really excites his base to come out to vote. They're not depending so much, let's say, on the tax law that got passed this past year. And finally, the authority is that political leaders can command respect. And what we're seeing here is kind of an interesting pathway where Donald Trump has had several members of his cabinet join him and then have since departed, as well as his staff. The question is when crunch time comes, if there becomes some national emergency, will the political leadership continue to march behind Trump and follow his authority in terms of willingly wanting to do what he, the president, wants to have happen?
Is it your sense we're seeing a questioning of the legitimacy of more institutions nowadays, even the courts? For example, the Supreme Court used to be held in high esteem. It still is, I believe, compared to a lot of others. But when you talk about the FBI, for example, the legitimacy of what they do, I wonder if people are just looking at almost anything in Washington with great skepticism.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. I think Donald Trump, when he was out on the campaign trail, was constantly raising the legitimacy of judges that were going to make decisions, for example, about Trump University. After he was in office, he's continued that path, and most recently, we have the confusing state of Rudy Giuliani, who has been a person associated with law enforcement and prosecution for over 30 years, who's carrying the torch of Donald Trump's messaging, calling the FBI sort of a group of Nazis and violating the rights of individuals. And I think that has long-term effects because Rudy Giuliani has, at least in the past, been a well-respected leader among the law and order folks in the United States. But we also have to recognize that there's been this long-term decline in terms of public trust. Presently, only about 18% feel that people in Washington are going to always or almost always do the right thing. If you go back all the way to 1964, we had the highest level of trust in recent history during the period at that point, but then it continued to fall and has dropped, particularly during the anti-war movements and then the result of Watergate. And we have sort of maintained this sort of balance of maybe about 40% or so having trust in government. Now, it differs between local government, state government, and national government for sure. But what we're finding right now is that Donald Trump is pulling up the bottom in terms of his administration being in a position where people trust Washington. To be fair to Donald Trump, though, it's not just Washington that's the home of Donald Trump. It's also Congress as well. We have a situation where people, when they look at their political leaders, particularly in the House of Representatives, most people say they don't really like or trust the other members of the 435 group in Washington, but they trust their own representative. So there's this little bit of disconnect. How can everyone like their own guy and everyone else's guy is bad?
I think you hinted at it. I know that, and I have a conversation scheduled with Ian Bremmer, who has written a book called The Failure of Globalism, but he says that President Trump didn't really invent this or even cause this anger to exist. He just exploited it. So it's been simmering for a while, I guess.
Yeah, there was a really interesting article actually in today's New York Times with John McCain talking about his choice of Sarah Palin as being one of his major regrets. He thought that in some ways he kind of hastened the pace of this action about reacting negatively against government and sort of being sort of the final cap on a movement that's gone on for a long time. There's an excellent documentary I asked my students to watch called America's Right Feeling Wrong, which is about the 2008 election and the people that supported John McCain and largely Sarah Palin, who couldn't really accept the outcome of Obama's win. And so this is not something that just happened because of Trump, but it is we're facing now a level of lack of trust that we really haven't seen in the past.
Are we on our way to something dangerous? I wondered. I was just thinking one day, actually right after he was elected, thinking, well, if the Supreme Court were to order President Trump to do something, what would happen if he said, no, I'm not going to do that? Well,
it's a closer possibility than many may think, because we're really facing a situation coming up with the future conclusion, we don't know exactly when, of the Mueller investigation, and whether or not the president agrees to sit down for a talk with Mueller or is subpoenaed, and what happens if he doesn't come in terms of a subpoena. Well, we get into a protracted legal argument that may ultimately get to the Supreme Court. You know, we're using laws that sort of fished around this area with Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton, but those were kind of different issues and at a very different point in time. And ultimately, it may come down to the Supreme Court making a decision. And as I heard one of the Supreme Court justices say, you know, we're 9 older people and we don't even have a military force. We have to rely on our own sense of legitimacy and authority to have people do what they're supposed to do.
Well, and we are in an historic time, I think, perhaps. Dr. William Rosenberg, always appreciate you being on. Thanks for being here.
Have a great day.
Bill Rosenberg is a professor of political science at Drexel University. He joins us from time to time to talk about, and today specifically, the question they often talk about in the classrooms, legitimacy, authority, and sovereignty. And where are we on that? He is tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg.